I'm going to talk, these guys are tough acts to follow. I mean, first Baroness Warsi and then Shagufta. Who decided on that order? I should have gone first. I'm going to share a little bit with you my thoughts, my experiences, some of the things that I know are out there, how communities have evolved, where they have sort of perhaps come to a stalemate position and are really struggling. But first of all, I wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me, Alex especially, for being so patient and so thorough. This is a really important conversation to have, and it's especially important to have it like this, together. Not in isolation of each other, not as young people on our own, on their own. I'm not so young anymore. Slip of the tongue. Not as women on our own, not as men over there on their own, and so on and so forth, but a conversation that we ought to have together, because that's the true reflection of honouring this particular topic. As has been mentioned before, I think Therese mentioned it, and I have a day job, and I am the programmes manager at an organisation called the Wolf Institute in Cambridge, and we specialise in interfaith relations. My particular work explores diversity, particularly religious diversity and cultural diversity, in the context of end-of-life care, palliative care. And so I work with public health workers mainly. Other training programs that I specialise in are on freedom of religion, freedom of belief. So religion plays a role in my day job. By night, however, I am president of an organisation called the Islamic Society of Britain. 24 years old now, would you believe? And I'm actually quite proud that it's during my time that we will celebrate our 25th birthday. The Islamic Society of Britain is a national organisation made up of individual members across the country. Individuals like you, like me, many young people. We have a young Muslim sort of aspect to our work as a project, and many older people, people who've been involved for generations. Their whole families have been involved for many, many, many years, in fact, since its inception. We were established in 1990, and we were one of the first organisations that sought to evolve a uniquely British flavour, a British context to Islam. Now, before anybody gets excited, that doesn't mean to say we're changing Islam, but actually we're enabling Muslims who are living, are born and raised and growing up in a British context to understand Islam for who they are and not for what it is to somebody in Southeast Asia or somebody in Canada or somebody in France, because we know cultures vary dramatically. So I think one of our key sort of aspects is this British context, this British flavour, and that's something that we take very, very seriously. You can have a look at our website to find out all sorts of different things about us. I'm not going to stand here and bore you, but needless to say that we promote a greater understanding and awareness of Islam, and through some of our work, whether it's talking about crazy people in the Levant, or crazy people right here in the UK, that sadly has become part of our work. But in the main, we want to encourage people, Muslim or otherwise, to understand Islam for what it is. We organise, we educate, we enhance the development of British Muslim communities. Now, as a community of British Muslims, we've evolved, I think, we've heard about arrival, we've heard about settlement, some people would even argue integration. We've heard about how communities have evolved in terms of how they feel themselves and how they look, and the way in which they respond to whether it's issues within the community or beyond. Now, examples of that evolution include the way in which we react to, say, for example, I was far too young to remember, but the reaction to the Rushdie affair in the late 1980s and 1989, to the way in which we react to very difficult situations today, but that kind of knee-jerk reaction, I think, for me personally, we're not quite there yet, but it has evolved significantly, and the way we respond, the way we react, has become a little bit more mature. Examples of that maturity also include the fact that Muslim men and women are present in the public sphere. There are people who are involved in the political spheres, in the social spheres, in the media industry. I don't need to say anything more about Baroness Warsi. Others include Rushnara Ali, who's a Labour MP for Bethnal Green and is Shadow Minister for Education. in the social sphere, people like Julie Siddiqui, people like Sarah Javed, who is the CEO of Made in Europe, people like Rabia Hanan, who's the director of New Horizons in British Islam, people like Sarah Khan, who's the director of an organization called Inspire. In the media, people like Michelle Hussein, many of us who are asked to speak to, whether it's radio, BBC Radio, whether it's ITV, whether it's something else, but many of us who, without the training or without the sort of expertise, experiment with that area too. There's also religious female leadership, and we all know about the religious male leadership, but this is something that's really sort of I think has a fair way to go. In terms of its authenticity and its presence in Britain today. We often categorize religious leadership with certain terms. So what does it look like? And so when we think of Muslim religious leadership, we often think, well, that must be, what, an imam? Or some people say an iman. Does that religious leadership wear a beard? Do they wear traditional clothing, or can they dress like this? Do they have a certain kind of education that comes from the Middle East, that comes from places like Saudi Arabia? What does it actually look like, and what does it sound like? And often when you think about that, it doesn't include women. And the kind of image that we create in our minds, many of us, is of something that doesn't quite look British or sound British even. So how does it engage in Britain with young British Muslims especially? When it comes to religious female leadership, we often feel that this can be sidelined to perhaps the home, the local community centre, in a mosque, but only teaching children, and only teaching female children, young girls. But where is that presence in wider circles like public institutions, mainstream institutions, teaching adults of whatever gender, and having the confidence to be able to do that without running the risk of, I don't know what it is that goes on in people's minds that could possibly happen. But that teacher-student relationship, for it to be like it used to be, as Saida mentioned before, 1400 years ago. My point really is how we categorize this religious leadership affects the way in which we then give it authenticity too. So we are complicit in that. And so when we understand that, well, you know, if you haven't studied in Syria, although who would go to Syria now, I don't know. But if you haven't studied in Syria for 6 years and you are not sort of dressed in a particular way, then actually you're not authentic leadership as far as my spirituality goes. And we fail to peel back those layers. We miniaturize people like that. And so we're all guilty of that. And so when we talk to Muslim communities, we often talk to people who look religious, and if we want to talk to somebody who's got real theological sort of kudos, then it has to be a man, it can't be a woman. And I know that there's a lot sort of packed in there, not least of which is traditional cultural norms and values that relegate women often to second place, whether it's within the home or within the community. And this has waves of impact on her throughout her life. She's seen or not heard as a child, perhaps. She's invisible as she's growing and becoming a woman. She's sidelined throughout her adult life, sacrificing all the time for the sake of others. So whether that be for her siblings, for her parents, for her partner, for her children one day. Now, there's nothing wrong with caring for others and putting them first and sacrificing. Some would argue that that's a secret to a good marriage. But when that isn't reciprocated, and it's one way only, and that becomes an expectation that's passed on from generation to generation to generation, it becomes systemic. And it becomes problematic. So what was once a beautiful thing then becomes something that's extremely harmful. This leads to a broader point about Muslim women and their ongoing relationship with the understanding of their faith. Across the globe, Muslim women are gaining visibility, and this ranges from participation in protests, in marches, not on Muslim issues, but on mainstream issues too. It also involves online campaigns, whether it's poetry that we heard before from Shagufta, whether it's blogs, whether it's being empowered by social media, because social media doesn't know your gender sometimes. If you choose to disclose, then fine. But if you choose to withhold, then social media actually doesn't know who you are. And that gives you the freedom to be able to ask the online fatwa website, whatever question you want to ask. But it also enables you to answer for yourself without saying, my name is Asma or Aisha or whatever. But instead, you can become a Muhammad, an Asif. I can't think of any other names right now. But you get what I'm trying to say, I'm sure. Muslim women are improving education. They are engaging in interfaith dialogue across the country. In fact, some would argue it's because of women generally that interfaith dialogue is as successful as it is in this country. And they're engaging in other forms of activism, like myself, being part of an organisation like the Islamic Society of Britain. For me, that is my activism. That is my contribution back to society. Here in Great Britain, also public debate around the niqab, the face veil, is really quite excitable. And I don't know how many of you have heard of a story today of a young girl in Camden who came back after the summer holidays with a niqab, wearing a face veil. And that's hit the news this morning. This demonstrates the kind of rhetoric around that story, the way in which it's being reported, the way in which people are commenting on it and feeling very passionate about it, demonstrates the delicate balance that Muslim women have to establish between the secular and the sacred, between the religious choice, the dogma, and their public liberties, like they have to make a choice between those when wearing a religious symbol. There are lots of issues around modesty that have become a symbol of Muslim women's identity, and they restrict the way in which we see those Muslim women. But also, they have an impact on how much those Muslim women return back to society, to communities. And so, by restricting them through the labels that we attach to them, we're also limiting how much they can contribute and what they can do. We saw in places like some would say the so-called Arab Spring now, but Muslim women clearly at the forefront of that Arab Spring. But we also saw some really difficult situations that women had to cope with and had to deal with. And a lot of that was around being the gender that they are, and also dressing or choosing not to dress in the way that people saw fit for them. So despite the successes and the setbacks that Muslim women experience, they are challenging patriarchy within the context of Islam and beyond, and are developing new women-friendly religious paradigms and spaces, sadly, I think, in my opinion. To have to separate and to have to create separate spaces in order to fulfill not just your spiritual and your religious duty, but your duty as a person, as a human being, is a really sad state of the society that woman lives in. But by doing so, she becomes a role model for others too, by interrogating misconceptions within her own community as well as others, by engaging in inter-community projects that create a positive impact in society. She helps to raise important questions about reform in Islamic thought and practice. By being who she is, she helps to raise questions. And raising questions is half the solution. Although Muslim women's activism usually takes place within a sort of, often people see it within the framework of a feminist ideology, and that has its pros and cons. The relationship between feminism and Muslim women is by no means straightforward, and with some women embracing feminism as a positive thing, as a productive thing, as something that is part of our history, from 1918, I think Shugufta said. Others are eschewing it. Others are disowning it because it's seen as a dirty word. And that's relative, okay? So that's for you and for me to understand feminism in the context that we understand it in, and own it or disown it as we see fit. But it allows women to articulate their struggles and take advantage of the opportunities that are available to them. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about sort of the current activism that I've seen across British society, but particularly through the Islamic Society of Britain. Austerity is a word we are no longer unfamiliar with. And it's not a word that's about to go away, sadly. In austere times, women across the board have been playing prominent roles in supporting communities, individuals, society as a whole, through various different programs, including food programs, whether it's a food bank, whether it's a soup kitchen, whether it's going out into the streets and sharing what you have with other people and enabling your communities to do the same. So there's a project in the Islamic Society of Britain that's about 8 years old now. It's called Eat and Meet. And it was designed by a group of 3 women who felt that they saw social issues within their community in Leicester and couldn't stand by and do nothing about it. So they've been involved from the inception, registered the organisation, fundraising, strategizing and 8 years on, it's still going. So strategizing, which is a key part of the project's work, creating rotas, doing shift work, arranging childcare, not doing the cooking, surprisingly, but we get that done elsewhere. But being at the heart of a project that actually brings women and men, young and older people together from across the society in Leicester. And other projects include things like Dine at Mine, Young Muslims, Islam Awareness Week, all of which have female leads in our organisation. Now, that's not to say that we're only women in the Islamic Society of Britain. Let me kid you not, there are many, many, many men. But men and women work together. Young and old work together in the only way that it ought to be. And ought to be in a very natural way without questioning actually why they're sitting together, why they're speaking over there. Why is it that the women are leading this project but actually the deputy is a male? And to move on from asking questions like that is really, really critical to how we move on as a society, as a whole society. I know I haven't got much time left, but I want to just quickly mention that the positive work that these women do, that us women, if I can be so bold as to say, do, actually is unsustainable. So if we think 5 years on, 10 years on, at the rate in which we're investing in our communities and the kind of sacrifices that are being made up and down the country, especially for voluntary organisations, is unsustainable. And so if we are to continue this trend and continue not just to talk about Muslim women and inspiring Muslim women, but actually to invest in them, whether it's in their structures, in their organisations, in training, in capacity building around them, in support, in mentoring. Because often many of us, we're kind of just finding our way as we go along. And so when I think of that, I also think of the sacrifices that they must be making. So if they're present here, where are they absent from? What have they given up? What have they sacrificed? What are they sacrificing in order to be involved in, whether it's a community project, whether it's an academic endeavour, whatever it might be? And do we have that sustainability? Do we have the resilience built into these community organisations and structures in order to be able to allow them to be role models for other people and encourage a greater number of women and men to come through the grassroots? Now, we can talk lots more in the Q&A, but just some of my thoughts for now. Thank you.